বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।
Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis for 14th July 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. Vaccination declines by 60% as states say they have no doses. So currently the Indian immunization program against COVID-19 is facing a certain shortage of vaccines, as we are seeing a current dip in the 7-day rolling figures of vaccines that are being administered. Now currently we are administering anywhere between 3 to 4 million doses, but we are nowhere near the high that we saw few days back, or at least in the few months where we were able to achieve 6 million to 7 million doses that are being administered on a daily basis. Now certain states like Maharashtra and certain other states in South India like Kerala are struggling for vaccine supplies, but that is the case with all over pan-India. Except for the Union Territory of Ladakh, no other state has been able to successfully achieve at least a high percentage of immunization. But nonetheless, we are on track to achieve certain targets that were set with the new immunization policy that was announced by central government. So the first hurdle seems to be the lack of access to vaccines. Few days back, Serum Institute of India announced that they will be able to produce, or they have in principle agreed to manufacture Sputnik 5 vaccines. We are also going to see Sputnik 5 vaccines from Dr. Reddy's lab in Hyderabad. Currently we have 3 vaccines in our basket, that is the AstraZeneca's Covishield, we have Bharat Biotech's Covaxin, and Russian's Sputnik 5. Government is still in negotiations with foreign manufacturers, particularly US vaccine manufacturers. Either it may be Moderna, it may be Pfizer, it may be Johnson, which is Johnson and Johnson vaccine. But the hurdle seems to be that of the indemnity clause, where they are asking for the indemnity clause to be taken away. So from that perspective, we are still engaging with those manufacturing companies. As far as Indian manufacturing companies, though the capacity has gone up, it is not yet at levels which would enable the Indian government to achieve its target of 60% of population coverage by the end of this year. So that is the situation in India in terms of vaccine against COVID-19. We are seeing a decline which is alarming, but nonetheless, let us be hopeful that we'll be able to see at least increase in supply of vaccines, and by the year end we'll be able to achieve at least 45 to 50% of vaccination in India, even though we may not be able to achieve the 60% because of access to vaccines. So this is just an update in terms of where the vaccination drive is at. So moving on to the next article, an unproductive idea. So recently states like Assam and states like Uttar Pradesh have brought in population control bills. The idea from both of the bills, particularly let us relegate ourselves to the Uttar Pradesh bill itself. The idea seems to be that in order to control population growth, incentives and penalties are being integrated into the policy framework to achieve the targeted population rates. Now let us look at the steps taken by the Uttar Pradesh government in terms of seeing its total fatality rate falling down. UP's TFR was recorded as 2.7 by the National Family Health Survey 4 in 2016. Now we know that we have a new National Family Health Survey 5, but before that the UP bill aims to, or the draft bill which was proposed by the Law Commission of Uttar Pradesh, aims to increase the rate of modern contraceptive prevalence, male contraception, decreasing maternal mortality and infant mortality rate significantly by 2026. Remember, there are 2 steps in the bill that they talk about. One is the 2026 deadline, and the third is the 2030 deadline. When we discussed this article in detail earlier, we said that though it might be achievable, but nonetheless it has to be skeptical at one point or the other, because things do not tend to move in that direction when population control measures are being spoken about. So on the face of it, we seem to align ourselves, or at least The draft proposal from the Uttar Pradesh government seems to align with the Cairo International Conference on Population and Development in 1994. But where we diverge from the concept of the Cairo Consensus is that the Cairo Consensus talks about promotion of reproductive rights, empowering women, universal education, maternal and infant health to untangle and solve the issues of poverty and high fertility, right? You have to ensure that an overall development, particularly a few days back where we discussed about SHRH, yeah, sexual and reproductive health rights, SRHR rights, how they are interlinked to women empowerment and how they enable population control or how they enable overall development of the society itself. So that is what the Cairo Consensus talks about. But the Uttar Pradesh government's proposal talks about adding incentives and penalties to achieve the same results that the Cairo Consensus talks about. But the problem is this is not something new. The idea of using penalties or incentives to achieve some sort of a population stabilization or control population growth have always been used in the past, but it cannot be said that they brought in the results that everybody was hoping they would bring, because it is a tried and tested path. But the penalties do not tackle the socio-economic issues. They may tackle the demographic one, but they may not tackle the socio-economic issues which are at the core of population discussion. So when you talk about socio-economic growth, it certainly involves the empowerment of women, because you give them the right to make choice. Depending on the choice, the population is directly impacted. So let us take the draft Uttar Pradesh population bill itself. The government aims to incentivize one-child families and reward those with 2 children with perks in government schemes. Not only that, they are going to give rebates in taxes. Loans will also get rebates. Cash awards are, if family planning is done among other things, cash rewards are also in the offering. So I'm not trying to demean the bill itself, but though the intention might be in the right direction, the approach is not what one would suggest if they know what has happened with similar approaches in the past, right? Disincentives for those with more than 2 children include denial of subsidies, denial of welfare benefits, and certainly the most important one, which bars them from applying government jobs and taking part in local elections. See, in 2003, Haryana government brought in similar things. This was not only the Haryana government. In the past few years, the undivided Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and certainly other states also brought in similar laws that stipulate or prevent somebody from participating in local body elections if they have more than 2 children. Even then, in 2003, the Supreme Court held that Haryana government's law, which barred a person who had more than 2 children from contesting local polls. But as far as the legal grounding for this is concerned, see, this is where the debate gets little bit muddled. Right? There is a Supreme Court backing the Haryana decision, but certain sections of the civil society are currently protesting that there is no constitutional backing to it. So this is where the confusion and the argument gets a little bit muddled. That is why we will not go into that. But as far as the current status quo is concerned, there is a Supreme Court backing for the similar provision that was brought in by the Haryana government. So now the issue comes to whether this will be a positive impact or a negative impact. So the question seems to be that there is no decisive or an indicative answer as to whether this will be a successful one or a failure one. You have certain examples from other countries and certainly other nations where similar steps have been taken, but the results have always been a mixed bag of results. You might not entirely get what you want, but you will get something, but not the actual thing which you want. So it might be confusing to think for a bit, but let me be clear. There is scientific enough evidence to state that the idea of using incentives and penalties as a method to gain some sort of population control or control population growth is both a success and a failure at a point of time. Meaning at a single time it is both successful and failure. In some aspects it is successful, but in some other aspects it might be a failure. Right, that is the issue here. Now, when you talk about measures that they take, empirical studies which were conducted, like similar measures which are termed as coercive by the author of this article, show that their discrimination against marginalized people, in particularly with no discernible effect on population control, while more substantive. So the link seems to be that instead of targeting the population growth itself, why not target the socio-economic aspects of it? Instead of introducing incentives or disincentives for people with more than one or two or three children, why not address the socio-economic issues that surround the population? So if you take the population of Uttar Pradesh, the hurdle is either the access to education, access to employment, and particularly the underdevelopment of women in Uttar Pradesh society. So in order to answer the population problem of Uttar Pradesh, attacking these three dynamics, empowering the women, enabling people to have access to education, access to employment, and make them aware of certain things, will certainly address the issue, all while bringing their socio-economic status to a good and a positive level. So that is what the author of this article suggests. Instead of going for the population control measure itself directly in a direct manner, which proved from time to time that they may not deliver the results that the government is hoping for, we must strive and endeavor to have an approach which talks about the socio-economic empowerment of the population rather than incentivizing or disincentivizing depending on their own family size. So that is what the current bills stands at. But again, this is just a draft bill. Until and unless it becomes an actual act, we cannot say anything about it. So moving on to the next article, upcoming crisis in Indian federalism. So 2026 is the year where India will go through its own delimitation process, where the boundaries for Lok Sabha seats, MPs and MLA seats are redrawn based on the population census that would be taken by a period of time. Currently, we follow the system which was decided in 1976, which was based on the 1971 census. So this was done to reduce the inequality that existed in India, particularly among states in India. Now in India we have this problem where certain states are highly developed and prosperous and have been able to at least achieve some sort of normalcy in population control or family planning, while there are other states which are poorer and are struggling in the family planning aspect of their society. Now that is why, to address these inequalities and to remove certain inequalities from the states themselves, it was decided that we are going to follow the 1971 census. Now with the delimitation process in 2026 impending or in the future, a lot of states are anxious about what will happen to them, because if the delimitation process happens, it is likely to happen in the size of population where certain poorer states have increased their population. So this 2026 delimitation process has certainly brought in certain anxiety in richer states compared to the poorer states. Now when we talk about the freeze that was put in the 1971 census, it ensured that most successful states in India are not punished politically for their success. Now with this call for realignment of boundaries in 2026, the balance between the democratic principle and the federal principle of the Indian Constitution is at stake here. So Article 1 of the Indian Constitution says India is a union of states. Now the choice of words here is deliberate, because whether it's a union of states. Recently the Tamil Nadu government also started using the word union more and more in their official communications with the central government rather than the word central government itself. Now it means that several states that together make up the Indian Union, not the other way around. Now we know that the democratic setup ensures that all citizens are equal and are entitled to equal representation in the governance. Now, that would immediately translate into this saying that the bigger states are likely to dominate the national conversation over smaller states. The natural fear that small states have is that they would get a smaller share of the economy or the pie of the economy compared to the richer states, and they may have reduced effect on national issues, and they might be irrelevant in political governance of the country altogether. That is the worry from the smaller states. Now, in order to ensure that these smaller states' fears are not legitimized, federal democracies all over the world, let us say India and America and other federal democracies, have incorporated certain safeguards in their governing structures. Now, this was done to ensure there wouldn't be any kind of compromise in the system itself that would tip the balance in favor of bigger states and away from the smaller states. Now, that is one way to ensure at least a functioning balance between democratic principles and federal principles. Let us look at the case of America itself. When America adopted its constitution, they went out of their way to protect smaller states in their constitution itself. They did it through 4 ways. The first one they did was national powers over the states were limited, meaning the federal or the union power, the central as we identify it, powers over the states were limited. Now, the second thing was that each state, regardless of size, had 2 seats in the Senate. So let us look at the case of Texas and let us look at the case of Washington DC. Their size is incomparable. Texas is the biggest, Washington DC is one of the smallest. Irrespective of the size of the state, each state has 2 senators representing the state in the House of Representatives. Now, this meant that irrespective of the size of the state, it will get its due representation and respect in the aspects of national governance. Whatever the role it may be, its size had no bearing on the national governance aspect because both had equal representation. Now, the third thing that they did was, which is aptly different from what we did, is in America, presidents are elected by electoral votes rather than by state votes. So they don't go for the popular vote. They go through the process called electoral college. That is why we saw Mr. Trump and Mr. Bush, who were elected through electoral college, though Hillary Clinton got the popular vote and Al Gore got the popular vote in their respective elections. That means that when a state electoral college splits its vote, meaning if it gets more votes than the other competitor, all votes of the state shift to that candidate. Meaning, in the case of Texas, the Democratic candidate was able to get only 50 seats, but the Republican candidate was able to get 52 seats. That immediately meant that this 50 Democratic candidate votes would transfer to the Republican, and the entire state would be declared as a Republican victory state. So that was the process that they adopted. They didn't go for the popular vote, they went for the electoral college voting system. The fourth one, which is more troubling in current times because it involves slavery, because was when the union was forming, there was a divide between slave owning states and non-slave owning states. In order to achieve an unification, the fourth aspect was brought in to assuage the fears of the slave owning states. Now, what they did was, the slave owning states which did not confer citizenry to the slaves, they were allowed to count the slaves for the purpose of representation. But here is the sad part. Instead of counting them as a single individual, they constituted each slave as 3/5 of a person. Their value was diminished. Even though they were a living human being, just because they were a slave, their value was brought down. So this was the fourth one which was done away, but whether you like it or not, the entire modern federal structure of the United States or the constitutional linkings that we talk about are built upon these four principles, and the fourth one, which is the most deplorable one, is rooted from slavery. Now, this has led, or this federal structure has led to the serving of causational links between national vote and presidential elections. So, that was the link. That is why we saw the electoral college system in place instead of the popular vote that we in India follow. Now, when you look at Indian aspect itself, any clash between federal principles and democracy will always trace back to the linguistic, religious, and cultural aspects of Indian society. See, this can be directly linked to the reorganization of states based on linguistic reasons. That is why we see a lot of discussion always falling back on the concept of region, culture, and linguistic basis. Because the division happened on those bases. Whenever there is a discussion about the federal principles or the difference between federal principles and democracy in India, they always fall back to that linguistic differences. Right. Now, with the reorganization or the delimitation process on the horizon in the near future, now it is time for the governments to allay those fears that are held by both bigger states on one side of it and by the smaller states on the other side of the spectrum. Right? You cannot get an other freeze like they did in 1971 and kick the issue to the future. If this issue would have been tackled in 1971 itself, or when the delimitation process itself was being discussed in the first place, we wouldn't have had this issue that we are facing right now. Now it is high time for the government to solve this issue instead of imposing an other freeze on the census or any other issue related to the delimitation process, and push this problem for the future generations to deal with, which they might not be capable or may not be able to do it at all because of the complications that we ourselves created. So that is what the issue with the delimitation process, and these are the fears that the states are holding on to when you talk about 2026 delimitation exercise. Now, what can we do in terms of assuaging those fears? These are some suggestions that the authors of these articles have propounded. Now, the first one is to the powers of state vis-a-vis the center contained in the list and in the provisions dealing with altering boundaries of the states must be increased to assuage the fears of smaller states that they will be dominated by the bigger ones. The second thing, the role and composition of Rajya Sabha or House of States must be expanded, and this would allow smaller states a kind of break over national majoritarian politics that may adversely impact them. The third would be to constitutional change and change in financial redistribution between the states must require the consent of all or nearly all states. Right? That is where the biggest discussion comes in economic distribution of our central tax schemes. When richer states who contribute more to the central pool are angry or at least dissatisfied with the idea that the smaller states or the poorer states which contribute less to the central pool are taking the majority share of the taxes or source of subsidies from central government. But that shouldn't be the way. It should be done with consensus, and every state must be an agreement in distribution policy or the scheme that the central government might adopt. Now, the fourth, which is more in the sense that very radical in the sense that it would change or alter the demography or the entire state structure in India, is to give a serious thought to breaking up of states into smaller units that not by themselves dominate the national conversation. This is something that would require a wide-scale acceptance from all aspects of the society. Some might not like it, some might like it. See, it is not like we haven't divided states. The recent example is the case of AP reorganization, where we saw formation of two states, that is Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. But again, you know how much discussion was, or how much trouble one can, if one can say boldly, was surrounding those reorganization itself. So, what is the underlying principle or fundamental principle or premise that underlines this entire discussion? That is the unity of India. But unity of India is not dependent on an overpowerful center or a less powerful center, because center has, if you think about the entire principles of federalism and democracy itself, the center has bearing to a extent but not beyond to it. Yes, a center has some role in certain aspects of how Indian state or Indian union works, but beyond a certain point, irrespective of how powerful it is or how weak it is, it has no bearing on the unity of India. It has bearing on the policies of India, but it has no bearing or little to less bearing on the unity of India. So this entire delimitation process, instead of applying a freeze or coming up with a policy that might not assuage the fears of either small states or bigger states, it is high time for to sit together and come up with a policy that would ensure every state gets equal representation, every states get their fair share of economical pie, every state gets its fears assuaged in terms of its own representation and its own voice and its own interest in national framework or national policy. So moving on to the next article, India to display relics of Saint Kitavan. Now, almost 400 years after she was murdered in present-day Iran, relics of Saint Queen Kitavan that were found in Goa in 2005 are likely to be put on display in India. Remember, she was a native of Georgia. Recently, our External Affairs Minister visited Georgia from Moscow and gave back or returned certain items belonging to Kitavan to the Georgian Republic. Now, that was the most celebrated thing that happened recently in Georgia, when India gave back certain relics belonging to this particular queen to Georgian state. Now the thing is, we still have the majority part of her remains in India. We just gifted a small portion to Georgia, and it is said that Georgia is also willing to display them publicly, but nonetheless India is also willing to display these relics which were hidden from public view since their discovery in 2005 and subsequent confirmation of authenticity in 2013. Now this is a holy relic from the perspective of the Georgians, and they revere her as a martyr because she was killed in 1624 in Shiraz for not converting to Islam. Now the idea was that Augustinian monks brought her remains to Goa, and they were lost till 2005, and they were recently in 2005 in excavation they were able to find these relics, and it was sent to DNA analysis for CSIR and Central for Cellular Molecular Biology, CCMB in Hyderabad, and they were able to confirm that it was her remains that were discovered in 2005 in Goa. So that is the issue. Moving on to the next article, the Assam government is planning to table the Assam Cattle Preservation Bill for 2021. Now, before the bill is tabled in front of the Assembly of Assam, the Chief Minister has came out and said that the primary objective of this bill was to check the smuggling of cows to Bangladesh. Now, the bill that they are talking about here seeks to replace the Assam Cattle Protection Act of 1950. Certain elements of the 1950 Act are still preserved in this new 2021 bill, and those include slaughter of cattle above 14 years of age or those that have become permanently incapacitated due to work, breeding, accident, or deformity after local veterinary officers certify that they are fit for slaughter. This has been remained, this aspect of that 1950 bill remains intact along with other provisions. Now the new one is that the new one says that no one will be allowed to sell beef in any form except at places permitted by the government of Assam, and beef will not be allowed to be sold in areas predominantly inhabited by Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and other non-beef beef eating communities, or within a radius of 5 kilometers or any temple, and the temple definition includes a satra or other religious institutions belong to Hindu religion or any other institution or area as may be prescribed by the competent authority. Now the idea is that the bill seeks to regulate the sale of cattle in recognized animal markets only. Now it also bans transportation of cattle to and from Assam as well as within the state until and unless a competent authorities issues a permit for the movement of animal. Now again, the competent authority will issue permit only for the movement of animal when there is a bona fide or animal husbandry purpose while following the rules laid down by the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act of 1960. Now these are the provisions of the Assam Cattle Protection Bill of 2021. Again, the government of Assam is willing to table this bill. We have to wait until this becomes an act to discuss further implications of the bill in the Assam society. Moving on, don't want to fight inside cities, says Taliban. Now, the current ground scenario is like this in Afghanistan. Majority of the territory in Afghanistan is under the control of Taliban. But Taliban controls majority of the territory in rural areas. But still major urban centers like cities in Afghanistan are controlled by Afghan government. The Taliban seems to be using this particular strategy where they are not capturing the city themselves because the security forces are able to push them back. They are trying to capture areas surrounding the major cities to block the cities from getting supplies. So the Taliban are taking control of main roads leading to that particular city. They are taking control of surrounding villages. They are preventing security forces and the population of that city from getting supplies from the Afghan authorities. Now what they are trying to do is they are trying to break the will of the security forces that are protecting these urban centers by cutting off their resupply routes and resupply access. That is why you are seeing a lot of action around major cities. One of the biggest things is Kandahar. So we saw Indian government pulling out its Indian staff from Kandahar. The consulate is still open, but it is being run by Afghan citizens but not by Indian staff. Kandahar is significant because that is where the Indian Air India aircraft IC-940 or something like that was hijacked and was held there by the Taliban. We had to send a military aircraft recently to get our staff from Kandahar back to India. See, Taliban at this point of time are saying that we are not going to attack civilian population. But on the other side, they are attacking civilian population. Because they are trying to, they control rural areas now. They want to take control of urban areas. Now when they are launching offensives against urban areas, they are saying that they are not going to fight inside cities, and they are asking for the security forces to drop their weapons and come and surrender to Taliban. Recently there was an example of 22 commandos being killed or executed when they were fighting. So what happened was the Afghan government sent a commando team to secure a village or something like that. When these commandos were unable to get ammunition, air support, or anything from the Central Afghan Authority, they had no other option but to surrender to the Taliban. Immediately after surrendering to the Taliban forces executed 22 commandos of Afghan National Forces. This was confirmed by both the government, the National Security Authority of Afghanistan, and including the commander's father who was leading that mission. So this amounts to a war crime. This was even confirmed by the CNN themselves based on various ground accounts. Now the Afghan National Forces, we know that they have been abandoning certain positions in critical places because they were not able to get ammunition, supplies, or any other critical needs to continue fighting. We know that Taliban right now controls major access points into Afghanistan from countries like Tajikistan, Iran, and other countries. Now, according to latest information, Taliban has gained control of a critical supply route from Pakistan to Afghanistan today morning or yesterday night. Right. So at this point of time, Taliban is gaining a lot of control on ground in rural areas, and they are gaining control over key supply routes to urban areas. The execution of commandos is one major thing that they have done recently. The second thing was they are going after Army Air Force pilots of Afghan Air Force and Afghanistan Army. They are finding who is a pilot in Afghan Air Force and they are executing them and their family if they are with them. Because one of the biggest advantages that Afghan National Forces have over Taliban is the air support. Afghanistan Air Force, though, has enough machinery, not compared to ours or any other regional powers, but they have respectable machinery given to them by Russia and America. But what they don't have or are in short supply of are pilots. Now Afghan security forces, Taliban are going after pilots and they are executing the pilots if they are found anywhere outside security zones. Now this is the immediate impact of US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. That is the ground situation in Afghanistan. The situation is becoming far worse than anybody expected, and everybody is hoping that the situation would get better, but the question is, will it get better? So that is the ground situation in Afghanistan. So moving on to the next article, high fuel prices threaten recovery. Now, according to economic research team from the State Bank of India, have allayed a fear that India's economy recovery could be delayed by rising financial stress on households. They are not talking about inflation, they are talking about surging fuel taxes. On top of it, you add inflation, this will certainly prevent our economic recovery, because these two things put together will put an unimaginable stress on family households finances. Remember, in the last 1.5 years, generally families which wouldn't have spent money on healthcare are spending more and more and more on healthcare because of COVID-19. Families are being subjected to extensive burden on healthcare spending. Their expenditure on healthcare has gone up substantially. Not only that, these families are now left to contend with rising inflation level and surging fuel prices. With all these three things combined, families' ability to spend goes down drastically. So the financial stress on an average household in India has gone up dramatically. That is the biggest hurdle that India is going to see if it wants an economic recovery in the coming next few months or in the next year. Now, there is a growing demand to cut taxes on oil to reduce its prices. One of the biggest demand has been to bring it under the GST regime. The problem with oil prices right now is the output ratio. The countries that control the output ratio in crude oil are not talking to each other. OPEC plus grouping, which was supposed to have its negotiation to increase their output to reduce the oil prices, global oil prices, broke down in between because differences of opinion or they couldn't reach consensus. So OPEC grouping left one side, Russia left the other, America went the other way. They don't have a consensus to increase their output, which would certainly result in reduction in crude oil prices, and that would certainly have certain impact on domestic oil prices. Since there isn't consensus in the production grouping itself, India is left with no other option but to purchase oil at higher prices. At one point or the other time, our petroleum minister has come and said that if OPEC grouping doesn't come to consensus to increase their output and have reduced the crude oil price, India will have no other option but to buy oil from Iran. But that is the long option. So nonetheless, high fuel prices are threatening recovery by having a direct stress or impact on the finances of an average household in India. So moving on to the next article, India's trade with China soared 62% in H1. So the bilateral trade between India and China hit its highest in the first 6 months of this year. This percentage has surpassed the pre-pandemic levels of trade between India and China. Now, India's trade with China in the first half of 2021 rose by a record 62.7%, and this has been the highest increase among China's major trade partners. Now, the total two-way trading bilateral trade between India and China has surpassed the pre-pandemic levels, but when you consider the one-way trade, it has increased by 62%. The trade between two countries for the last 6 months stand at 57.48 billion, the highest ever recorded for the first half of the year. Now, the trade was before the pandemic stood at 44.72 billion. This was the pre-pandemic record that was noticed in the first half of 2019. So, this increase is a big jump compared to what we had in terms of pre-pandemic trade level. Now, India's exports to China, though increased or climbed 69.6% to 14.72 billion, still the trade is skewed in the favor of China. When we are talking about Atmanirbhar initiative, being self-reliant, being no longer linked to the supply chains of Chinese, these numbers do not translate well, and we need to dig deeper in order to understand what were the primary drivers for such an increase in bilateral trade with China. Now, this is the situation with India's trade with China, despite having an actual critical situation in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
বৰঠাকুৰ IAS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।
বৰঠাকুৰ IAS একাডেমি।